Tonight, my guest is international criminal lawyer, Nick Kaufman. He, of course, is the lawyer of some of the most well-known individuals, both in politics and business, who often appear in international fora and institutions such as the International Criminal Court. I understand the case or the client that you're defending is a Zimbabwean businessman who found himself on an Interpol most wanted list, unable to travel to his business. You've got the who's who in the world and certainly in Africa on your client list, from members of the Gaddafi family to Imelda Marcos.
Naging client niya pala si Imelda Marcos.
The case that you're in South Africa for right now.
Well, I was invited here by Mr. Buyanga, who has been made essentially a victim of the Zimbabwe justice system. Mr. Buyanga was operating a very
What an irony.
Successful property acquisition business in Zimbabwe, unfortunately came into contact with one of the officials in the Zimbabwe government who made a loan to. After making that loan, he suddenly found himself subject to a reinitiated criminal investigation.
Parang yung nangyayari kay Pastor Kibuloy, di ba? Na-dismiss na yung kaso niya noong 2019, tapos parang binuhay na naman ngayon. This is what's going on in the Philippine government ngayon. And ito yung specialty nitong si Attorney Kaufman, ano? Sige, tuloy natin yung kanyang kwento.
Soon thereafter, to an Interpol red notice. I should stress that this criminal investigation
soon after may red notice. Di ba, ang buwelta natin, bakit walang red notice list or wala sa listahan ng red notice itong si Prrd? Big question. Samantalang itong si Buyanga ba? Meron siya, nalagay siya sa listahan.
Ongoing criminal investigation which was initiated as a result of disgruntled customers back in 2010, and the chief superinspectant at the time, Chikandiwa, who had investigated the case, declared on oath to the Harare High Court that the case lacked any criminal essence to it, and he had closed the criminal investigation.
So how does your client appear on the Interpol list?
Well, what happened was that 2 years later, after the loan arrangement with the minister in Zimbabwe, he suddenly found himself subjected to an arrest warrant. And that arrest warrant apparently is the basis for the international red notice, the Interpol red notice. The effect of this essentially is that Mr. Buyanga cannot travel around the world without the threat of being detained at a port of entry and then perhaps made subject to extradition proceedings if the country to which he's travelled has an extradition agreement with Zimbabwe.
Now, of course, the question of regulating international...
So, parang lumalabas na itong si Buyanga na ito, successful na businessman. Tapos parang politically motivated, siguro inggit.
You've been a prosecutor at the International Criminal Court at The Hague. You now defend clients who have to appear in front of this court. Take us through the procedures of the ICC as it relates to the laying of charges, what prosecutors have to look for, and then, of course, also the kinds of ways in which people have the right to defend themselves. And essentially what I want to get to, Mr. Kaufman, is do you think the ICC has legitimacy, and do you think that people get fair representation in institutions like that?
Well, you've asked a whole load of questions, and I could speak all day about the fairness of proceedings at the ICC. Let's take the specific issue of travel. Don't forget that the ICC is a court. It has a prosecutor who analyses whether or not there is evidence to put an individual on trial, but it operates according to evidence, and only when there is sufficient evidence to warrant a prosecution does the prosecutor then go before the court and ask for an arrest warrant. Interpol, and should take another example, the United Nations sanctions committees, the various sanctions committees set up in various conflict zones around the world, don't operate always on the basis of evidence. They operate on the basis of intelligence information, which is often supplied by an interested state party.
Oh, delikado yun. Sabi hindi raw sila normally nagbabase doon sa evidence. Doon sila nagbabase doon sa kung ano yung chinucho sa kanila. 'Di ba? Intelligence, kahit sabihin nating intelligence information. Pero paano pag chucho lang 'yon? 'Di ba? Tapos yung nagchucho yung parang Trillanes type. Delikado po 'yun. Matubato, kung sino-sino diyan, na si Aling Sheila, yung mga gano'n, delikado po 'yun.
Now, coming back to the ICC,
Right.
after an arrest warrant has been submitted and perhaps granted, requested and then granted, an individual has a right to defence counsel and he can challenge the evidence. That's unfortunately not so much the case at Interpol or before the United Nations sanctions committees, where often a lawyer who's representing a client is subjected to a restrictive measure, whether it be a travel ban or whether it be a red
Freezing of
notice,
assets.
or whether it may be freezing of assets, he's not entitled to any information. There is no transparency. There's no right of appeal afterwards.
Nako.
All he can do is make his submissions and, as it were, shoot in the dark.
Oo, delikado. Submissions, pero walang appeal. Paano na yan?
That's the distinction between the various supranational, should we say, regulatory bodies such as Interpol and the United Nations sanctions committees and the ICC. Now, the question of whether or not the ICC is a fair and just institution, well, it is, for all intents and purposes, a court which has been set up as the result of a multi-state party agreement. It's not a United Nations court. That's the important thing to stress here. It was set up by the state parties, and the state parties who are, of course, signatories to,
Right.
that court. There are a number of state parties
Who are not
who are not
signatories.
signatories, and most notably the state parties or the states where conflicts are ongoing or are involved in conflicts. The United States, for example, is not a member of the International Criminal Court, nor is Russia, nor is China, nor is Israel. So to say, is it a fair institution? Well, you have to ask the people who asked for this institution to be set up. Now, the major criticism which has been levelled at the International Criminal Court
May ingat siyang sumagot, no?
is that it is too Africa-centric.
Yes.
And
Yes.
that
In
it's-
fact,
African-centered talaga. Panay mga taga-Africa yung hindi nila kaya yung China, ang US,
Too much of an interest in Africa.
Russia.
let's park there because the latest or the most well-known cases that are in front of the ICC now, of course, is the kind of major players in the Kenyan political elite. In fact, Uhuru Kenyatta, the recent candidate that was victorious in the Kenyan elections, is in fact indicted at the ICC, Mr. Ruto, as well. You have had dealings with these individuals. I've spoken certainly to a number of Kenyans who believe, as you pointed out, that the criticism is that the ICC is too Africa-centric, and given the fact that so many of the parties that are not signatories to this court, their political and strategic interests are tied up on a continent like Africa, that these institutions are being used as political instruments. In the Kenyan example, from what you know, would you say such a charge is a fair one?
Well, Kenya is a bit of a special case because, unlike the other African situations which are currently on the docket of the International Criminal Court, the Kenyan situation was really forced upon Kenya as a result of prosecutors' proprio motu. The same is also for Côte d'Ivoire as well, the situation there. But an investigation was conducted by initiated, shall we say, by the former prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, Mr. Luis Moreno Campo. And he targeted his investigations against, for all intents and purposes, the Uhuru Kenyatta. He has now won the elections. That is the democratically expressed wish of the Kenyan people, whether you like it or whether you don't. I think Mr. President Kenyatta has stated that Kenya intends to honour its obligations to the International Criminal Court. But yes, there has been a lot of criticism, and perhaps rightly so, because of the witnesses that the prosecution have been selected. And this is not just the Kenyan people's criticism of the International Criminal Court.
May history din pala itong ICC na may pagkabayas pala. Ito yung kinikwento niya na itong particular na situation na nangyari kay President Kenyatta.
It's also the court's criticism. The court has been scathing in its criticism of the Office of the Prosecutor, in its modes of interviewing witnesses, in its modes of disclosure of evidence. And in fact, it has been stated that one of the judges, a very well-known Belgian judge, a very serious academic in the field of international humanitarian law, Judge Christine van der Wiegert, has asked to be excused from the case as a result of the behaviour of the Office of the Prosecutor. Whether or not that's the case, I don't know, I'm not sure. But the fact that a judge has asked to be excused from a case is in itself a significant matter.
So, isa daw particular incident, one of the judges ay nag-excused ba, parang nag-inhibit, kumbaga, kasi parang may question siya doon sa proseso. So parang si Solgen, 'di ba? Ayaw niyang sumagot, ayaw niyang ipagtanggol yung gobyerno, which dapat yun yung trabaho niya. Kumbaga parang nag-i-inhibit siya. So doon pa lang ang point dito ni Attorney Kaufman, the mere fact na ginawa mo yun, may question doon.
Kaufman, from where you're sitting, do you think that the case against the Kenyan president has no foundation? We know that one of the 4 people attached to the case has actually been dismissed for lack of evidence. Do you think we're going to go the same route here?
From what I know of the case, and of course I'm not privy to any of the evidence against President Kenyatta, but from what I've managed to gather from reading the materials surrounding the case, I think that the case is basically built on legs of straw. I think the case is going to fall apart sooner or later, yes, unfortunately. Yeah.
Now, if criticism...
Ito, sabi niya, I think the case is gonna fall apart. Sabi niya, totoo siya, tama siya, kasi kung titignan natin dito sa record ni Kenyatta, no? I'm looking right now dito sa record ni Kenyatta. Case closed to. Ayan, no? Withdrawn, sabi niya. Charges withdrawn. Case closed. The case is considered closed unless and until the prosecutor submits new evidence. Ibig sabihin, mahina siya. 2011 pa to, 2011, 2012. So, di ba yung interview kay Attorney Kaufman ngayon, anong sabi niya? Confident siya na ma-acquit si Tatay Digong. Ito sinabi niya prior to the initial hearing or the proper hearing ni Kenyatta, ni President Kenyatta. Sabi niya confident din siya na walang patutunguhan yung kaso na yan sa kanya. Which, ito case closed, withdrawn kay Kenyatta. Ayan. So the mere fact na sinabi ito ni Attorney Kaufman, may confidence siya na sabihin, kumbaga nakikinikinita na niya
international justice, but not necessary for President Kenyatta. I don't think that on the basis of what I've read, that the charges really are made out against him. It seems highly bizarre.
The charges are made out against him.
The nature of the charges against him. And furthermore, the way that these charges have been investigated don't seem to be, to me at any rate, been the most... doesn't seem to me that the most professional methodology has been employed.
Question sa kanya kung paano nila inimbestigahan. Methodology, unprofessional. So for Attorney Kaufman to say this very early stage prior to the President Kenyatta's hearing, positive para sa akin na makita na ganito ang confidence ni Attorney Kaufman.
Now, it's interesting that you highlighting the shortcomings of the operations of the prosecutor. You yourself was a prosecutor at the ICC.
That's correct.
What do you think happened in the Kenyan case? And as a former prosecutor, what is the mechanisms that the institution has to ensure that prosecutors do not abuse their position and actually, comply with the rules of evidence that ought to be there, that lays the foundation of whether someone is going to get a fair trial or whether even the basis of the charges are legitimate to begin with?
Well, I think here in the Kenyan situation, there's a matter of personality involved. The present prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda, is a completely different character from the former prosecutor.
Pinag-compare niya yung present prosecutor doon sa former prosecutor.
The former prosecutor was an extremely flamboyant individual. His control of the English language was particularly
flamboyant daw yung dati.
poor. which unfortunately is a serious disadvantage for a prosecutor.
Tapos hindi raw marunong mag-English. Di ba yung sabagay hindi yung prosecutor, di ba nakita niyo yung nagsalita yung si Julia Lily Motok ba yan? Julia Motok ba yan? Or Lilia Motok. Hindi marunong mag-English, tapos pinupuna pa yung buhok niya na ang gulo-gulo na parang hindi naligo. Diba?
Appearing in front of a tribunal where the main languages are English and French, his handling of the cross-examination of Uhuru Kenyatta in the confirmation proceedings was very amateurish, and the sort of questions which were asked were completely below the belt.
In short, ang professional daw yung prosecutor. Yung dati.
President Kenyatta's finances. And they were asked in a very poor fashion questions, well, the charges were confirmed, but then, as I said, serious criticism has been levelled at the methodology employed by the Office of the Prosecutor to investigate the case. That criticism has to lay at the former prosecutor's door. Now, Fatou Bensouda has inherited that case, and she's a different character entirely, far less publicity-seeking, far more, shall we say, acceptable to the African community in the sense that she herself is an African. It's harder to level against her the same sort of criticisms which were levelled at the former prosecutor.
And do you think the fact that she is African and the fact that she is not seen to be grandstanding, if you like, that would lead to a more granular and more thorough approach, whatever the outcome of the case against Mr. Kenyatta?
Well, my personal knowledge of the present prosecutor is that she is a very thorough individual, and that she has a very professional take on international justice. And
so depende rin pala sa prosecutor, no? Yung current prosecutor ngayon ay si Karim Khan, di ba? Karim Khan na ang advisor niya ay si asawa ni Clooney, si Amal. Tropa ni Maria Ressa. So medyo questionable tayo doon, medyo tagilid tayo doon.
Yes, I do think that there's definitely a change for the better. But one of the most notorious actions of the rebels is, of course, the murder of Muammar Gaddafi. And now this is a case which has been documented. There have been videotapes. The evidence is there. It could have been gained immediately if the Office of the Prosecutor, which did have the mandate at the time, went to the scene of the crime, had taken ballistic evidence, had taken forensic evidence, if a proper autopsy had been done on the body of Muammar Gaddafi and, of course, his son Mutassim, who was also murdered in the most brutal fashion. If all these things had been done, then a credible case could have been formulated and brought against the people responsible for.
And why do you think the ICC didn't do that?
Well, it's hard to guess why. I mean, I can only infer that perhaps the people who are pushing in various directions, pushing the people at the ICC, are putting the emphasis on other aspects of the conflict, and perhaps nobody really wants to know the real reason why Muammar Gaddafi was murdered and who did it. Perhaps there is more to hide than that people just don't want to come out into the open. I really don't know the reason why. I firmly believe, however, that this matter should be investigated. It has to be investigated. It was an awful crime. No matter what you think of the man, no matter what you think of what he did, and he did a lot of good for Africa, I must say, his murder was one of the most abhorrent acts witnessed in recent times.
Now, if you have that kind of
So, ang question dun is, bakit hindi inimbestigahan ng ICC? So, lumalabas dito na parang itong ICC pala, yung investigation na sinasabi nila, bumabase lang sila doon sa mga sinasubmit or inire-report sa kanila. So, what if yung magsasubmit na mga personalities ay tainted, kumbaga bias? Kasi makikita ninyo kahit sa mga western media, ang ini-interview nila yung mga makakaliwa, yung mga dilawan, yung mga yellows. Paano naman yung sa kabila, 'di ba? Like for example, yung mga pro Duterte or yung ally kay Duterte. So, ang ini-interview nila, ang ini-entertain nila, yung sila Trillanes, sila Rizal Ontiveros, sila Laila de Lima, o kumbaga merong merong unfair na collection of information tapos sasabihin nila, investigation nila ito. Lumalabas na ganun. Which is, papasok dito yung pagiging bias ng ICC.
Activity from international bodies. To what extent do you think the individuals that eventually end up, like some of your clients, in front of the ICC, stand any chance of having a fair
trial.
Trial, and that the procedures would be legal and lawful? We know that Charles Taylor, former African head of state, has been found guilty.
Now, if you say, the International Criminal Tribunal's places where justice is dispensed in the most, shall we say, efficient fashion and fair fashion, well, that's a moot issue as well. I'm not going to stand here or sit here in the course of this interview and criticise the judges of the International Criminal Court. Of course not. I assume that
Galing niya sumagot na very safe.
the judges are carrying out their duties in the most professional manner, and I have no reason to suspect otherwise. However, criticisms can be made of various tribunals as can be made of any court of law in a domestic country. And you touched on the issue of Charles Taylor, for example. Well, Charles Taylor was convicted and sentenced to 50 years. His appeal is the result of his appeal is still pending. But there was one judge.
Ito. May isang judge daw dito sa kaso ni Charles Taylor. Convicted siya ng 50 years, pero may isang judge na iba yung decision. Anong ginawa?
Who dissented.
Right.
Dissented.
And pending.
Dissented, ibig sabihin, iba yung kanyang decision. Tumataliwas doon sa decision ng mga ibang judges. Tingnan natin anong
But there
ginawa.
was one judge who dissented.
Right.
And when he tried to read out his dissent, the microphone was shut off on him.
Pinatayan ng mikropono?
Wow.
Now that became a very hot issue as well amongst academics.
Questionable yun, di ba? Why? Kung fair trial ito, ako as spectator, no? Kung fair trial ito, at lahat ng judges maliban sa isa ay nagbabasa ng kanyang dissentment or decision, sarili niyang judgment, bakit niyo pinatayan ng mikropono?
And people who are involved in international justice, I mean, what right did the court have to switch off the microphone?
Ang korte, ang ICC court ang nagpatay
of a judge who was merely expressing his right to express a dissenting opinion. So yes, criticism can be leveled, but by and large, the International Criminal Court has shown itself. I'd also like to add, with respect to the quality of justice dispensed at the International Criminal Court, I mean, a lot of criticism has been made that it's Afrocentric, but let's not forget that the African-centered court has rendered a number of judgments. Well, one judgment in a trial, but in which it has convicted somebody, that was Lubanga, but it's also acquitted somebody most recently, and that's in Matthew Ngujorochu, involved in the Democratic Republic of Congo.
So sabi naman niya, although may mga controversial issues na bakit isang instance may pinatayan ng mikropono, on the other hand, meron din namang mga incidents kung saan na-acquit naman yung mga akusado.
It was also dismissed the charges against a Sudanese warlord, and has also dismissed the charges against a former client of mine, Calixto Mbarashimana. So to say that the International Criminal Court is biased in favour of the prosecution is totally not true. But I personally think that the most difficult case to defend that I've dealt with was the case of Calixto Mbarashimana. He was alleged to have been the Secretary General of a Hutu emigre movement operating in the northeast Congo, the FDLR. I found this difficult because the charges which were levelled at him were outrageous. I mean, it was the most brutal and abominable mutilation of women, rapes, and the way that the crimes were linked to him were quite spurious. I mean, he was expressing his freedom of speech. He was sitting in France. Never actually been to that part of Congo at the time period relevant to the charges, and essentially this was a case where the former prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, wanted to get a scapegoat for the crimes which had been committed, the awful and horrible crimes which had been committed in Congo at that moment in time. He was accessible. He was down the road in Paris, a few hundred kilometers away from the International Criminal Court, and there's no question that he could have been brought before the court very quickly. But was it fair and was it right to pin on him these awful crimes? And the answer is absolutely not, because his actual statements which he'd made, and the case was based on a mode of liability where they were alleging that he was a party to a conspiracy on the basis.
May mga cases pala na alam mo yung parang dinadala sa Hague na pinagbibintangan lang. Kagaya yung si Tatay Digong. Akalain ninyo dinagdag sa case ngayon yung rape? Kung titignan nyo yung record ni Tatay Digong ngayon, may nakadagdag doon na rape. Eh di ba binasahan na siya doon sa initial appearance? Wala namang rape na nakalagay doon. So magtaka ka ngayon, bakit may nakalagay na rape ngayon?
Of being a spokesman for the movement, for the FDLR movement, when his messages to the public were basically calling.
So, pinakita ko sa inyo kung gaano katalino itong si Attorney Kaufman na ito. The way he answers, the way he has this very broad knowledge of how to defend even the most brutally accused or sabihin na nating brutal na mga like Gaddafi, di ba? Kayang-kaya niyang depensahan. So, dito, isa sa kanyang naging client ay itong si Maxim Mokom Gawaka. So, dito, ito po yung initial appearance niya na nangyari 2 years ago, in March 2022. At nag-initial appearance nga siya dito.
Thank you very much.
Medyo, ayan, initial appearance siya dyan. Ayan, tapos ayan si Attorney Kaufman.
Your Honor, my name is Nicholas Kaufman, and I have the extreme privilege today to represent a former minister of the Central African Government, Mr. Mokom, who is sitting behind me. Your Honor, since I'm appearing here on my own today, may I seize the opportunity to greet my friends from the prosecution, Mr. Kweku.
On my own, mag-isa niya. Parang si Attorney Mideldea na mag-isa niya nung initial appearance.
Who I have known for years to be a fierce and fair prosecutor. May I congratulate Mr. Nyang on his recent election to the post of co-deputy prosecutor. I wish him all the best in the judicious execution of his role. And of course, I would have welcomed the chief prosecutor, Mr. Karim Khan, a friend of mine for years.
Karim Khan.
But I do realize he has a lot on his plate these days.
Grabe Andiyan si Karim Khan
Thank you very much.
Okay, so nabasa dito, binasa ang kanyang case dito. Ayan.
Court officer. Mr. Court officer, would you please read out the charges as presented in the public redacted
Okay, cut
version?
natin yung pagbasa ng kanyang kasi mahaba yan. Pero gusto ko kayong dalhin doon sa pagsagot ni ni Attorney Kaufman.
If Your Honor pleases, maybe I will address this matter. Mr. Mokom has given me permission to address the chamber on the matter.
I would like to hear from Mr. Mokom first, okay. Then you can compliment. Mr. Mokom.
Gusto ni presiding judge na magkomento si Mokom. Nag-butt-in si Attorney Kaufman na siya yung magsagot.
Monsieur le Président.
Your Honor.
Ito yung former minister.
My counsel would speak to you about that.
Sabi niya, hindi ka magsasalita?
You don't have any remark to make?
You don't have any remark to make?
Well, if you, sir, this is the point. Your counsel will be allowed to speak, but if there's anything, any concern that you have, we would like to hear it from you. Then your counsel will complement as being the legal experts. But if there's anything
bahala na yung abogado ko.
You want us to hear, we would like to hear from you.
Le conseil est chargé de vous dire.
The council is responsible for telling you that, Your Honor.
Is it? Mr. Kaufman, please.
Ayan na. Nanalo si Kaufman.
Your Honor.
Ito, ilalatag ni Attorney Kaufman yung ginawang mali doon sa pag-aresto. Kagaya yung kay Tatay Digong. Diba? nilatag din ni Atty. Medeldea kung paano ginawa. But we will see that further pagdating ng confirmation of charges this coming September 2025. But let's see kasi syempre magkakaroon pa tayo ng appeal application ng interim release at of course sa pangunguna ni Atty. Kaufman.
May I say at the outset that my client doesn't have any observations regarding the conditions of his detention at the ICC. However, I do have a few observations on Mr. Mokom's transfer to the International Criminal Court and his treatment at the hands of the authorities of the Republic of Chad. Now, it didn't escape my notice that the learned prosecutor, Mr. Khan, issued a press release a few
Kinwestiyon niya agad si Karim Khan. Kanina binati niya, ngayon kinwestiyon na niya.
days ago.
Ulitin
Notice that the learned prosecutor, Mr. Khan, issued a press release a few days ago in which he expressed his heartfelt gratitude to the Chadian authorities for facilitating the transfer of Mr. Mokom to this court.
Kine-question niya bakit nagpasalamat yung prosecutor na si Karim Khan doon sa government ng Chad.
But I ask, for what exactly was he heaping this lavish praise on Chad? Let me tell you the facts as Mr. Mokom related them to me. On the 27th of February, he was surprised on a dusty road near the border with the Central African Republic, bundled with brute force into the back seat of a security vehicle and driven 13 hours in the blistering heat, sandwiched between two security officials to N'Djamena. Upon arrival, he was thrown into a filthy, mosquito-infested cell in the dungeons of the National Security Agency. All the money which Mr. Mokom had on his person was seized, and with most of it, it was used to pay the officers who had brought him all the way to N'Djamena. The remainder of his money was used to buy his daily ration of food, mouldy bread and a tin of sardines. With a raffia mat on a stone floor for a bed and an empty tub of butter to relieve himself, Mr. Mokom was kept incommunicado for a week without anyone knowing.
Mas brutal pala yung ginawa sa kanya, no? Kaysa kay Tatay Digong at si kay Tatay Digong kahit na ganun. Ito, mas brutal yung ginawa eh.
Where he was.
Kinulong pa siya muna ng 2 weeks.
Finally, on the 7th of March, Mr. Mokom received a visit from the Procureur de la République, who asked him if he had anything to say about the ICC charges which he read to him. Mr. Mokom mentioned that he had a lawyer called Mr. Kaufman, but he was told that he had no right to a lawyer.
Ganon. He has told no right to a lawyer.
He received yet another visit, this time from no less than the Procureur Général de la République himself. And once again, the semblance of a judicial process took place, and Mr. Mokom asked for his Israeli ICC lawyer. And I can assure you, Your Honours, there aren't too many of them knocking about. At no stage did the Procureur Général inquire with Mr. Mokom as to whether his rights had been respected. At no stage was Mr. Mokom told that he had a right to seek interim release in Chad, pending surrender to the court. And believe you me, had I known that the arrest warrant dated back to the 10th of December 2018, I would have petitioned for such interim release. In any event, Mr. Mokom was slung back into the darkness for yet one more week, when suddenly he was moved into new, more salubrious surroundings of the variety reserved, no doubt, to impress visiting human rights organizations and the ICRC.
Parang giwi
To impress more salubrious surroundings of the variety reserved, no doubt.
Oh, parang giwi
To impress visiting human rights organizations and the ICRC.
But anyway, okay, kakat ko na ito, no? Kasi looking at Attorney Kaufman, confident siya na ma-acquit si Tatay Digong. Ako naman, looking at him, na confident siya, alam ko na confident din ako na kaya niyang ipagtanggol si Tatay Digong. Naalala niyo yung pinakita ko kanina, na sabi niya na confident siya doon sa kay Kenyatta na mapupunta sa wala din, which is it became true kasi case has been withdrawn na-withdraw. Kumbaga, natapos na kaagad. Ganun ka-confident itong si Attorney Kaufman. And I do believe na tamang counsel ang kinuha ni VP Sara or kinuha ni Tatay Digong dito para i-represent siya. So, yung ito si Mokom na ito, ang kanyang initial appearance ay March 2022. Tapos nag-set itong presiding officer na ito, presiding judge na ito, na ang kanyang next na hearing, which is yung confirmation of the charges, is January 2023. So that's about 10 months, no? Kay Tatay Digong 6 months. So ganun talaga ang ano dito eh. Ganun talaga yung haba ng proseso, parang every year, every 1 year. Nakita ninyo yung in-expose ni SAS na about sa budget ng ICC. Siguro ganun talaga ang gagawin nila. Kailangan meron silang case within a year para makakubra sila ng budget every year. Kasi meron ding budget hearing yung mga yan. Parang sa Pilipinas na meron tayong GAA na pinag-uusapang budget. So, panoorin niyo yung kay SAS na kasi may in-expose siya doon na parang lumalabas na pera-pera din pala ang ICC. So, yun lang. I do believe na magandang senyales na itong abogado ni Tatay Digong ay itong si Attorney Kaufman.